Good day. Today is Saturday, 3rd January 2025, and before I begin with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button, and by the way, check your subscription to this channel. If once you have watched this video, you decide that you like what you have heard and you want to indicate that fact. Well, today, or rather I should say last night, the long-expected, long-awaited American attack on Venezuela eventually came. I have said in many programs, stretching all the way back to the moment when this enormous concentration of US Navy assets started in the Caribbean, that I found it very difficult to believe that Donald Trump, the President of the United States, having gathered together this enormous naval armada off the coast of the Caribbean, would call it away, would allow the situation in Venezuela to remain unchanged. Sooner or later, some kind of an attack against Venezuela was likely to happen, and well, eventually it did happen. The United States has conducted various performative acts over the last couple of months. They've carried out attacks on speedboats, which they claim were smuggling drugs. There have been all sorts of claims that President Maduro of Venezuela was himself the head of some kind of major drugs cartel. There were seizures of oil tankers ferrying oil from Venezuela, mostly, as it turns out, to China. By the way, over the last few days, there have been reports that big Chinese oil tankers flying the Chinese flag have been steaming towards Venezuela in apparent defiance of the effective American blockade, and that there was a lot of talk that there would be a major crisis on the seas, on the high seas, between the US Navy and these Chinese tankers. And we've also had the bizarre incident of the United States chasing another tanker, the Pella II, which raised the Russian flag and became registered in Russia's Merchant Navy Registry. But it seems to me that what we've now seen over the last couple of hours is probably something that was in preparation for quite a long time. In fact, I've had one particular person who has been telling me for some time that something like this was perhaps likely to happen. And that was that there were officials. The CIA has been busy in Venezuela. It's been bribing officials of the Venezuelan government, bribing military officers in Venezuela, all in preparation for some kind of military operation against Venezuela. And the military operation has taken place over the last 12 or so hours, or at least 24 hours. And from what I can understand, it appears to have taken place in what might be described as a very restricted format. It is focused on the seizure, the capture, the kidnapping, if you prefer, of the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his removal to the United States, where the President of the United States says that he now is, and where the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, says that he's going to stand trial. Not clear what the charges will be, but presumably they will be drug smuggling related or something of that kind. I say that because it appears that as at the time of making of this program, the rest of the Venezuelan government continues to be in place. The vice president is still in Venezuela. The defense minister and the foreign minister have just spoken, have been speaking. They've all condemned this American attack on Venezuela. It appears that the Venezuelan security forces are still in control of Caracas overall. There seems to be no attack on the oil installations or the energy installations in Venezuela. So, what we've seen, in effect, is a high profile, massively orchestrated, gigantic abduction of basically one man and his wife. The United States carried out this huge attack basically with one objective: to get President Maduro himself to the United States, Nicolas Maduro himself to the United States. And I find it impossible to believe that Venezuelan authorities, the other Venezuelan authorities, the military, the many people within Maduro's government were not directly complicit in this operation. We have seen helicopters, American helicopters, large, slow moving Chinook helicopters flying over Caracas. There is no sign of any air defense operating over Caracas. There's been no attempt to shoot down these helicopters by anyone within the Venezuelan military. Venezuela has air defense systems. Apparently, still has an S-300 system that was supplied to Venezuela during Hugo Chavez's time by Russia. They have large numbers of manpads, the kind of short-range, handheld air defense systems that are perfect for shooting down slow-moving, large helicopters flying close to the ground. But there is no sign that anything like that was being used, and we see no sign of the Venezuelan Air Force. Venezuela has some Sukhoi 27 fighter jets still operational. They've made performative actions over the Caribbean, but there's no sign that they have been put into the sky. The United States did conduct some kind of attacks on Venezuelan air bases, but presumably, if there had been a genuine plan and a genuine purpose to resist this American attack, someone in Venezuela, some sections of the military in Venezuela would have resisted, would have put up some degree of organized resistance, and so far as I can see, there has been none. And the United States itself is claiming, the President of the United States and his officials are claiming that as a result of this attack, no one in the American military, no part of the US military personnel, not a single soldier, airman, pilot, sailor has been killed, or as far as I can tell, even injured. So we've had airstrikes on some bases, but the most important part of the operation was the capture of President Maduro, and that really was the totality of it. It was, in other words, a violent abduction carried out clearly with the complicity and of most, probably pretty much all, of the Venezuelan political, military and security establishment. Without it, it couldn't have been done. And I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons it has taken so long for the United States to carry out this action, why the United States has waited all of these long months to carry out this action, while the American fleet has been there, but no action of this kind has been taken up to now, is clearly because the negotiations, the deals, the bribes, if you like, had to be paid. The various people across the Venezuelan government had to be brought round and bought over, and this took time. But that time has now come. The Venezuelans, the Americans, have achieved what they wanted, and we see that the operation has now been carried out, and it has been carried out successfully. So, where does this leave the situation in Venezuela, and where does this leave the United States? Well, as I said, for the moment, as of today, the Venezuelan government, the regime, if you like, is still intact. The army is still there. The police forces are still there. They still control the country. The vice president will no doubt step in and announce himself as the person in control. But sooner or later, in some way or other, some kind of negotiated deal with the United States almost certainly is going to be done. I suspect there will be elections in Venezuela of some sort at some point over the next few weeks or months. And I suspect that as a result of these elections, the people favoured by the United States, perhaps Maria Machado, will be elected, and Venezuela will once again have a pro-American government. This whole scenario, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has pointed out to me, is very similar to what happened in Syria in November 2024. Again, to all appearances, a very large, very strong Syrian military melted away after basically brief attacks by a very, very small, carried out by a relatively small force of jihadi fighters. And it was quite clear that what had basically happened was that the various Syrian generals, the army officers, the political leaders, the kind of people who made up what had up to then been the Assad government or Assad regime, had been bought and bribed into compliance. And it is the same sort of operation that we've seen in Venezuela. Now, the big question is, once we do see a pro-American government in Venezuela established, how strong is that government going to be? And I'm going to say this. Venezuela is very much in the United States' own neighborhood. The United States has had a very long history of very deep and close connections with Venezuela. There is a middle class in Caracas that is deeply hostile to the Chavez and Maduro governments and to the kind of social and economic reforms that those governments, particularly the Chavez government, carried out. The United States is likely to find willing collaborators in Venezuela, and in some ways, a restoration of a pro-American government in Venezuela would represent a restoration of the norm, and that must give it at least some prospect of success. Against that, it must also be said that since the 1990s, Chavez especially has carried out major social changes within Venezuela. The population is far better educated than it was before the 1990s. There's been significant economic and social reforms. Obviously, there's been periods of intense economic stress and economic crisis. But it might be, again, difficult to revert to the kind of situation that existed in Venezuela before Chavez came in. And here I should say the problem with Maria Machado and Venezuela's extraordinarily fractious and bitterly divided opposition comes to the surface, because of course they've never reconciled themselves to these changes. They've never recognized that there were reasons why Chavez came to power in Venezuela in the first place. If they try to reverse everything that happened under Chavez and to some extent under Maduro, if it seems to them that they can, reverse the clock and take Venezuela back to where it was before the Chavez changes took place, then I suspect that this is going to cause major problems and major stresses within Venezuelan society. They will be a little bit like the Bourbons in France after the fall of Napoleon. They will have learnt nothing and forgotten nothing, assuming that the clock can be turned back to the time before the French Revolution, rejecting every change that the revolution itself brought about, and then discovering that those changes are so deep and so much part of the web and texture of French society that they couldn't be undone, and that the attempt by the Bourbons to undo them, it ended in total failure. And I would not be surprised if something similar happens to Venezuela as well. In which case, of course, there are also risks. Venezuela is a heavily armed society. Much of the population carries firearms. We did a recent program from Venezuela on the Duran, and it seems that the Venezuelan government, up to now, has been in complete control of the country. Venezuela is not a society like Colombia, where for the last 70 years, the Colombian government has only had nominal control of large territories within Colombia. If there is an attempt, as I said, in Venezuela to simply turn back the clock and to revert to the situation that existed before the 1990s, there is at least a possibility, or so it seems to me, that this will start to provoke resistance and opposition, and that the situation in Venezuela might become increasingly fractious and unstable. And we could even begin to see a start of prolonged political violence in that country, very similar to what we have seen happen in Colombia. Anyway, that's for the future, because as of this time, we don't know. We don't know what the current Venezuelan government intends to do. We don't know what the United States plans for the long term. We don't know what the role of Machado is going to be. But what I have set out, I think, is at least a plausible outline for the future. Let's now talk about the geopolitics of this. And of course, firstly, let's talk about oil and Venezuela's enormous oil and gas riches and its various deposits of minerals and things of this kind. Of course, for the United States, gaining control of these things will be very useful and very important. American refineries, many American refineries, particularly in the south of the United States, are geared to refining Venezuelan oil, a Venezuelan heavy crude. When Venezuela was not providing that oil, the United States had to switch to buying that oil from Russia, because Russia can also produce heavy crude. The United States, under Biden, for a time continued to buy oil from Russia. It stopped doing so. Then it switched to buying oil from Venezuela, and we're likely to see that happen again. And eventually the United States will no doubt re-establish control over the Venezuelan oil industry and all of these other minerals and things that we have in Venezuela. I'm going to anticipate by saying that this is not going to be the great geopolitical game changer that many people assume it is. The United States, as I said, dominated the Venezuelan oil industry for decades before the coming of Chavez. It continued to import oil for much of the time that Chavez was president of Venezuela. Nobody spoke of it then as changing the situation geopolitically. It might make it easier for the United States to tighten export sanctions on Russian oil exports, and that might be part of the American agenda. But then countries like China, which used to import Venezuelan oil, and which are presumably, no longer going to be able to import that oil, now have an even stronger reason to import oil from Russia. And I'm going to suggest that that's probably true of India as well. I don't think that the Indians are going to change their policies or switch to buying American oil in place of, or Venezuelan oil in place of Russian oil, simply because Venezuela is probably likely to pass under American control before very long. So just saying. So I don't think that this strengthens the American position, and I don't think it's going to make a huge change to the situation in the oil markets. The United States needs to be very careful about developing Venezuelan oil, because, of course, what people tend to overlook is that over the last decade, the United States has become itself a major producer and oil exporter. Given that the Chinese and the Indians are likely to continue to buy Russian oil, the risk the United States runs is that if it starts developing Venezuela's oil industry in the way that some people assume, that could end up competing with its own oil industry in the United States. The many smaller producers in the United States who depend on a high price of oil and whose contributions to the American economy and to President Trump's electoral coalition are not to be underestimated. One reason, incidentally, why, despite the exuberance in the American stock market, the AI bubble and all of that, production in the United States for most of the last year has been basically flat, is because the American oil industry has already been hit by falling oil prices, and that has had a depressing effect on US GDP figures, just saying. And it's not been particularly good for some of the producers, the oil producers in the United States. So the United States needs to maintain a balance in the oil market. It needs to maintain a sufficiently low price to satisfy its consumers, but it doesn't want the price of oil and oil products to be so high that it undermines the stability of its own oil industry. This is something, by the way, which, so far as I know, very few commentators have picked up on, but I know that it has been discussed within the oil industry of the United States itself. What this does, what this operation in Venezuela does, however, is that it advances the American agenda set out in the National Security Strategy Review document that was published a few weeks ago to turn Latin America into an American sphere of influence. And in fact, to my mind, putting aside the personal animus that clearly exists towards President Maduro on the part of some American officials, including the president himself and the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that is the ultimate objective behind this operation. It is to tighten control on what the Americans now consider to be, or at least the current administration now considers to be, America's sphere of influence, Latin America. Now, that over time is going to be increasingly alarming to the various Latin American states. And here I'm going to discuss the wider geopolitics. Whenever operations like this are carried out by the United States, regime change operations in countries like Syria and Venezuela, the immediate cry that comes up is, where are the Russians? Where are the Chinese? The short answer is they're very far away. Neither country, neither Russia nor China, has a global reach, the same kind of global reach that the United States developed during the Cold War. They never have done. Russia has no aircraft carriers. Its only aircraft carrier, the Kuznetsov, is rusting, as I understand, in a Russian shipyard. There was some talk about bringing it back into service and modernizing it. But the general conclusion on the part of the Russian military and naval establishment appears to be that it was an unsuccessful project and that it should be deleted. China does have aircraft carriers, one supercarrier which has just entered service, and two smaller carriers. None of these can compete with the US Navy, which has 10 supercarriers in service, and even more so, a huge string of bases around the world which the United States built up first during the Second World War and then during the Cold War, and which it retains. Gradually, US naval leadership has been eroded. The United States is unable, apparently, to build frigates or smaller ships. The Constellation-class frigates have just been cancelled. There are problems with the US nuclear submarine fleet, apparently. Russia's nuclear submarine fleet, which for the Russians is their overriding naval priority, is growing in size, and the Chinese fleet itself is also growing in size and power and effectiveness every day, and is becoming a major challenge for the United States Navy, as I've discussed in many programs, by the way, in the Pacific. But both China and Russia are primarily focused on their own regions. China has been conducting a series of increasingly aggressive naval exercises around Taiwan, and there is increasingly these exercises look like a dress rehearsal for a potential blockade of Iran. The Russians are gradually gaining ascendancy, it seems, in the Arctic and the North Atlantic, and that is their priority area too, as well as the Sea of Okhotsk in the Pacific, but these are adjoining seas. Neither country has the global reach at the present time that the United States just about still has. And absolutely they do not have a global reach in Latin America, which since the 1820s has in effect been the American backyard. Whenever the Russians have attempted to intervene in a big way on the Latin American continent. Their attempts to do so throughout the Cold War were unsuccessful. And Venezuela is another case in point. There is Cuba, Caribbean island. It has close historic connections to Russia. It has a growing economic relationship with China. There was a major crisis over Cuba during the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a deal done between the Soviet Union and the United States at that time that the Soviets would withdraw their nuclear missiles from Cuba, and in return the United States would promise not to take any step to try to bring Cuba back under the control of the United States. And, by the way, the United States also agreed to withdraw its intermediate nuclear weapons from Europe at that time, a fact, a part of the agreement that was never disclosed. I am not sure whether the United States still considers that agreement as still being in effect. And, well, Cuba has gradually started to work closer to Russia over the last decade or so, but it's been a slow process because the Cubans, feeling very betrayed after the Soviet Union collapsed, have been deeply mistrustful of Russia. They rejected oil exports from the Russians up to now. Economic connections between Cuba and Russia have not developed to the extent that I and others had anticipated. And of course the Russians, unlike the Soviets, have no direct military presence in Cuba, though the Chinese apparently at an ephemeral level perhaps do. Given that Cuba is obviously a potential target, it'd be interesting to see whether the Cubans, who have, I think, a more solid political system than Venezuela did, whether the Cubans now start to adjust their policies, whether they embrace the BRICS more actively, and what it is exactly that the Cubans are going to do, and what responses the Russians and the Chinese take if the Cubans do start requesting stronger military and political assistance. I think Cuba potentially would be a greater challenge for the United States because of the solidity of the government there, and because I suspect the Cuban armed forces are a more organized force than the Venezuelan armed forces have turned out to be. But ultimately, again, when it comes to Cuba, the Russians and the Chinese face many of the same problems that they faced with Venezuela. Anyway, we will see what they do. But if we talk about the bigger geopolitics of this, the most obvious thing that's going to happen, it seems to me, is that the Chinese and the Russians are going to draw closer together. China has lost access, or will soon lose access, to Venezuelan heavy crude. Some of its refineries now must be based around that. China must be worried about American steps to try to interfere with China's imports of oil. This is going to accelerate energy cooperation between China and Russia. Oil deliveries to China from Russia are secure. They can be sent by pipeline. They can be sent by ship because China and Russia have joint coastlines, and the oil deliveries can be more securely protected. I suspect that this is what will probably now happen. Neither China or Russia were able to intervene to stop the events in Venezuela. The Russians say that the Venezuelans, and they've been saying this for weeks now, that the Venezuelans never asked them for any sort of assistance. And I have to say, that is exactly how it seemed to me. There were some reports that Russian Wagner fighters were sent to Venezuela, but I was categorically told that this was not true. So the Russians were not involved. China has a much bigger economic footprint in Venezuela than Russia does. Shortly before President Maduro's abduction, President Maduro met with a Chinese delegation headed by a representative of President Xi Jinping himself. Xi Jinping has been humiliated and infuriated by what has happened. The Chinese will not take this well. To put it mildly, it is, in my opinion, a much bigger embarrassment for China than it is for Russia, because the contacts between China, the economic contacts between China and Venezuela were so much closer. But again, to repeat, there was little realistically that the Chinese could have done. Their response, I think, will be to draw closer to the Russians. And I'm going to suggest that, in fact, in a way, the Russians are going to be winners from this affair, because the Chinese are going to need them more. The big loser amongst the BRICS states is the BRICS country that no one ever talks about, which is Brazil. Brazil is a big country. It's a huge country. It has an enormous population. It has enormous cities. It has a large economy. It has abundant resources. It has been trying to establish itself as a major independent force in world affairs. It's spoken of itself as a future great power. President Lula of Brazil has tried to play a role in Ukraine-related diplomacy. He is a major advocate of BRICS, the BRICS financial instruments. He has actually supported and been the main advocate of a BRICS currency, something which none of the other BRICS states, China, Russia, or India, have been keen on. So Brazil has set itself out as a major global player and ultimately as a rising great power. And yet here we are, Venezuela, a country close to Brazil, a country in Brazil's immediate neighborhood. And Brazil has done and is able to do nothing. It has no military forces to speak of. Its military is very small. It has none of the kinetic strength that a great power is supposed to have. It hasn't helped that Lula and Maduro detest each other and are rivals. And, well, even as the American build-up around Venezuela took place, Brazil remained passive. If Brazil had thrown its weight against this operation, if it had sought to unite various Latin American states to oppose it, then that might have made a difference. But it did no such thing. And, well, as a result, it has seen an American-conducted regime change operation carried out in its own neighborhood by a United States that has openly spoken about the need to exclude China and Russia, but of course principally China, from having any role in Latin America whatsoever, including having any role in Latin American trade. And of course China is Brazil's biggest trading partner. So, what are the Brazilians going to do in response to all of this? The short answer is I don't know. I am not particularly well informed about the situation in Brazil, but I would suggest that people who want to be critical of the Chinese and the Russians perhaps ought to be asking questions of the BRICS power, the big BRICS country in the neighborhood, the one that perhaps ought to have played the most decisive role in this crisis, which is Brazil, and which has chosen to do nothing. Anyway, there we are. We will see whether this causes any change in Brazilian policies. What I would say is that Latin America itself, in its totality, over the last few months has been swinging right. We've seen Milei win an election in Argentina. We've seen right-wing candidates win elections in Bolivia and Chile. We've seen a right-wing candidate backed by Trump win an election in Honduras. There is a general drift back towards the right across Latin America. This is the product of economic failures, the failure of left-wing governments to build on the economic successes that they had achieved in earlier decades, and the fact that the situation in all of these countries is much more complex than I think many people outside Latin America understand, with large sections of the societies of Latin American countries always leaning very strongly towards the right and seeking good relations with the United States anyway. So the fact that there has been this swing to the right across Latin America inevitably is going to mean that there is going to be a muted response, a far from united response by the Latin American countries to this affair. But in the long term, in the longer term, especially if there is instability in Venezuela as a result, as a consequence of this operation, then things might start to change. There is also a strong anti-American current within Venezuela, within Latin American societies, that might start to resurface. Even many right-wing people in Latin America probably will not be happy to see the United States conduct regime change operations in Venezuela again. It will remind them too much of the kind of regime change operations that the United States carried out in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. And, well, if we start to see a drift back, an attempted drift back to the kind of iron control that the United States used to wield over Latin American societies as recently as the 1970s, I'm going to guess, I'm going to predict that is going to encounter increasing resistance. Now, around the world, this will not be received well, but it will also be received with a shrug of the shoulders, because everybody knows that the United States continues to do this sort of thing. It's just a case of the United States doing more of the same. President Erdogan of Turkey, who had very good relations with President Maduro, is said to be extremely angry and has condemned this strongly. There will be ritual condemnations at the United Nations and in the Security Council. But everybody around the world, outside Latin America, understands very well that this is what the Americans do, and this is the Americans acting like this in what they have always considered to be under Democrat and Republican administrations to be their backyard. Perhaps the other people who need to be most nervous about this operation are not the BRICS countries, the other big BRICS countries, but the Europeans. Because a point which I've not yet made in this program, but which I'm going to make now, this was a flagrant violation of international law. It is something that is impossible to reconcile with international law, or indeed with the rules-based international order that the United States keeps talking about. The United States carried out this operation without informing the Senate Armed Services Committee, without going through even its own domestic legal procedures. It has acted to seize and capture the leader of another country, Venezuela. It has demonstrated again that there is no law or concept of law that will inhibit in any way its actions. And this at a time when the United States has been acting in an increasingly predatory way against its own European allies, when it has been eyeing Greenland and saying that it wants control of Greenland. Denmark might be saying to itself, well, what the Americans do in a place like Venezuela is really their own business and maybe not so important to them. But given that the United States is so willing to throw the rule book out of the window, who's to say that they won't throw out the rule book in the same way over Greenland and one day introduce the American military into Greenland and announce that Greenland has been annexed by the United States. So, going back to the National Security Strategy Review, we could see the drift back towards spheres of influence, the United States realizing that its quest to achieve global hegemony is over, that China and Russia are too strong, that India maybe is rising. That means that the rules-based international order is now going out of the window, just as international law, as far as the United States, is going out of the window. It's going to be now a pure game of great powers carving out spheres of influence. Latin America for the United States showing no inhibitions about what it does in Latin America, trying nonetheless to maintain some kind of equilibrium with the other great powers. Very unstable equilibrium, though that is going to be. And of course, in a system like this, the Europeans are no longer friends and allies. They are at best vassals, and vassals that can probably be dispensed with at any time. So this is the world that we're going to see, and the Venezuelan operation is part of that. That is at least how it looks to me. Anyway, there we go. We will see what happens in Venezuela over the next few days and weeks. As I said, for the moment, Maduro may have gone, but the rest of the government and its military and security services still appear to be there. I suspect that over the next few weeks and months there will be negotiations done, as I said, leading to elections in Venezuela. But anyway, Maduro himself, I'm confident, is in the United States, and no doubt he will be placed on trial, and we will see how things turn out for him. But for him personally, I suspect the future is bleak. China and Russia will deepen their cooperation. The Chinese will focus increasingly on resolving the problem of Taiwan. And the Russians will benefit from this affair because they will be able to tell the Americans, well, you talk about aggression, us committing aggression against Ukraine. Look at what you've just done in Venezuela. But beyond that, anyway, the alliance between us and China has now become more secure and more important for us because after these events, the Chinese are going to need us more. The Russians, by the way, just to say this, have also come out relatively well, far better than many expected from the Syrian affair too. They've not only retained their bases in Syria, and I understand that they're now starting to deploy forces to those bases again and use some of those bases to continue to send supplies to their allied countries in Africa once more. But the new Syrian transitional government, al-Jalani's government, seems to be turning to them increasingly for military help, even as other communities in Syria also seem to be turning to the Russians for some degree of protection as well. So the Russians have been able to ride the storm in Syria quite successfully up to now. Obviously, the same won't apply to Venezuela in the same way, because Venezuela, as I said, is a place much closer and more important to the United States. But in terms of the long-term effects, as I said, it's going to play to their interests. China will be furious and will take its own actions. The big questions for the future are for the Latin Americans and for the people of Brazil. The other people that this is a question, that this all begs questions about, I should say, are people within the United States and in the West itself. The Americans have been told, the American people have been told that they have a president who is a president of peace, who does not want interventions, who just wants to keep the United States out of forever wars. Well, he's just threatened Iran, where protests continue, of course, and he's now conducted a regime change operation in Venezuela, little different from that of previous US governments, and a neocon operation in every respect, identical, as I said, to the ones that have been carried out before. If Americans really do want to see a change in the way that their country conducts its affairs, that is, again, up to them. I myself don't think that Venezuela, that this game that the United States has played in Venezuela is going to be any sort of long-term success. I think that the United States should be focusing on its own internal problems rather than in the problems of Venezuela, which are quite likely to become more complicated. These adventures, which is what they basically are likely to drag the United States into further trouble. So, as I said, Americans continue to have those questions to ask themselves. But this is a big topic. I've discussed it in many programs. I'm not going to return to it again. At the moment, at the present time, spheres of influence very much seems to be the current game. It was something that Alex Christoforou and I said was likely to be the future pattern of policy of the Trump administration shortly after Trump was re-elected, we did a program about it, and it does seem to me increasingly as if this is the direction of travel. And I'm going to make a prediction. If the Democrats regain the White House in 2028, the same will continue to be so. I don't myself believe that anything will change. I think that focus from now on will be on spheres of influence, and that the period of the United States attempting to be strong everywhere all the time is indeed over. But that does not mean that the United States has softened or become weaker or become less ruthless. On the contrary, it will mean that the United States is going to become more ruthless still, tightening to the extent that it can, control over what it can. Anyway, that's my discussion today about the events in Venezuela. There is a lot still to discover about what has taken place, and we will see what the direction of travel is over the next few weeks and months. Now, let me finish this program by briefly returning to the topic of Ukraine. Zelensky continues to conduct a major reorganization of his government in Kiev. And he's apparently appointing a very young man to become his new defense minister. The defense minister who's currently in post, who's only been there for 6 months, is apparently going to be sent off and reassigned to do other things. This person who is taking over from him has no military background, no experience in military matters. Very difficult to see exactly what role he's going to play in conducting the government. I can't avoid the impression that this is not just a change of guard that is taking place in Kiev, but basically a reconstruction of the regime. And it seems to me that Budanov continues to be the rising force within the regime that still continues to function in Kiev. Meanwhile, there's been less news from the front lines over the last 24 hours, though the Russians have made more progress, more advances in the Siversk direction. As I've discussed in many programs, the fact that we're getting less news from the front lines doesn't mean that things are not happening on the front lines. Very often, important things are happening, but both the Russians and the Ukrainians, for their own separate reasons, want to keep the facts secret and tighten control over the various reporting channels. And the soldiers are in the two armies who provide those reports. And I suspect that that is the case. The Russians also carried out more drone and missile strikes over Ukraine over the last few hours, though they have not yet carried out the promised response against the Ukrainians for what they claim, what I've no doubt was the attack on Putin's residence in Valdai, or the attack on the hotel in Kherson region, which led to the deaths of 27 civilians. So we shall see what happens there. But anyway, that as I said, is the news, the basic news from Ukraine. One other thing that is taking place is that there's a meeting underway of national security advisors from Europe and from Ukraine, and it's difficult to understand what the purpose of this meeting is. But my sense again is that its primary purpose, once more, is to try to work out some way to recalibrate Ukrainian diplomacy in order to counter these furthest moves that Donald Trump apparently told the Russians that he was taking, pressing Zelensky to think hard about a comprehensive peace settlement with the Russians. As to the terms of that peace settlement, the Russians remain as implacable as ever. Just saying. Anyway, the war goes on, and let me repeat again, the war in Ukraine, which is a proxy war between, well, not even a proxy war basically, but it's a conflict between the Russians and the collective West, which the collective West is losing, continues to be a far more important event than the fall of Syria, the fall, if it has fully taken place, of Venezuela, or any of these things. Some years ago, the French philosopher, intellectual, Emmanuel Todd, talked about how the United States, in order to, well, conceal its weakness relative to the other great powers, China and Russia, likes to put on, from time to time, performances of micro-militarism, attacking very weak adversaries who it is able to show can be defeated quickly and cleanly, to convey an impression of strength, even whilst in fact, relative to the other great powers, it does no such thing. And I would suggest that what we've just seen in Venezuela is another perfect example of precisely that kind of micro-militarism that the United States is very much addicted to. What happens in Ukraine, by contrast, remains very consequential. And as events in Ukraine continue to gain force, well, what happens in Venezuela will start to fade in importance, will start to attract less attention, which is the same as what we're seeing happen in Syria with the Syrian conflict there. Anyway, this is my program for today. As I said, an important event in Venezuela, no doubt. A tragic event in many ways, because whatever one's views about the Venezuelan changes that were initiated by Hugo Chavez, ultimately they were an attempt by Venezuela and its people to chart an independent course. The United States has never looked with any favor on any Latin American country that attempts to do that. Sooner or later, whenever it is attempted, the Latin American country that tries it invariably finds that it is coming up against enormous American hostility and opposition. If the Americans cannot persuade the country to change its course, to revert back to the kind of pro-American, America-favorable policies, the United States then starts to take ever more aggressive actions. We've seen that play out with Venezuela, with sanctions, with support for the opposition, with attempted coups in Venezuela, major disruptions of Venezuelan society. events which have led perhaps to the government in Venezuela itself evolving and morphing into something which perhaps was very different from what Chavez himself perhaps intended when he first entered Venezuelan politics back in the 1990s. But we see, again, the events play out in Latin America. As always, eventually, the attempt to carry out change is suppressed. The United States intervenes, in this case, directly. The government structures that have been established, the attempts at change are dismantled, and we go back to what was there before. Someday, one day, the people of Latin America will gain their proper independence and liberty. But for the moment, the famous quote of the Mexican president Porfirio Diaz, made sometime around 1900. He was a pretty ruthless character altogether, by the way, and a dictator by most metrics. Anyway, Porfirio Diaz, speaking about Mexico, once said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the USA." The same, so far, has been true of all of the Latin American states, even if, in terms of distance, some of them are further from the United States than others. One day that will change, but we're not there or close to there yet. Anyway, with that thought, this is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Don't forget to check out our new Substack page, site. And last but not least, please remember, if you like this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.